I mean, you hear of these cases, but the full horror of them doesn't strike you until it's happening under your nose.
Yeah. He spoils her badly.
No, I wouldn't say badly. I think he's made a first-class job of it. Aileen.
What?
That was the name.
What name?
On the tip of my tongue.
In 25 minutes, Ken Dodd tops the bill at the City Varieties Theatre, Leeds, for The Good Old Days. First on BBC1, the 9 o'clock news with Angela Rippon.
Mr Callaghan announces the day he's chosen to go to the country. The general election, forced by Mrs Thatcher, will be on Thursday, May the 3rd. Good evening. 5 weeks from today, the voters will decide whether Mr Callaghan returns to Downing Street or whether Mrs Thatcher becomes Britain's first woman Prime Minister. It was on her motion of no confidence that the government was defeated in the Commons last night, and she wanted an election before the end of April. But the Prime Minister, after a cabinet meeting and an audience with the Queen, announced this timetable. Parliament will be dissolved on April the 7th. Polling takes place on Thursday, May the 3rd, the same day as voting in local elections in England and Wales. On May the 9th, MPs will return to Parliament to be sworn in. Today, after the drama of last night's debate, MPs were clearly eager for campaigning to begin. Mr Callaghan, the first Prime Minister since 1924 forced to call an election by a Commons vote, told them he hoped it would be fought on issues and not on personalities. We begin today's major story only a few hours after the opposition leader's historic victory in the Commons. Michael Cole, the reporter.
Mrs Thatcher's day began with a triumphant welcome home from her husband. In her own phrase, the vote had been a famous victory, one to savour after 4 years as Tory leader. The cameras were still there when, after 6 hours' sleep, she set off again for the Commons. The campaign will take her to Scotland and Wales and most of the English provinces.
I'm just a little bit worried about the mornings and the provincials, because they're
After bringing down the government, the question now was, could she keep them down?
Do you think you'll win the next election, Mrs Thatcher?
I believe we shall win, but I'm very conscious that that's the sort of question, asked of every party leader. Every party leader says that, and the only way to do the best you can is to work as hard as you can.
Yeah.
As she went off to hear the election date, there was no mistaking the feeling that even if spring fever declines to come, election fever is definitely in the air.
Well, while Mrs Thatcher was waiting to hear the election date at Westminster, Mr Callaghan was at number 10, thinking over alternatives. April the 26th, May the 3rd, or May the 10th. Michael Sullivan reports.
Mr Callaghan's day began with a visit from his cabinet ministers for what would normally have been the routine weekly cabinet meeting. Their mood appeared to be cheerful and ready for the fray, as Mr Roy Mason, the Northern Ireland Secretary, put it. Once they'd agreed on the most important item, the date of the general election, the Prime Minister drove the short distance to Buckingham Palace to see the Queen, traditionally the first to hear details of a government's surrender of authority and submission to the electorate. That didn't take long, and the crowd in Downing Street who'd watched his return from Buckingham Palace had not long to wait before he reappeared on his way to Parliament. That election date was still a secret, and despite the barrage of questions from the waiting reporters, the Prime Minister, still displaying the breezy confidence with which his ministers had started the day, was to keep it a secret for just a little longer. And he was driven along Whitehall to the House of Commons, where he announced just after 3 o'clock that the election would be on May the 3rd.
Just under 3 hours later, in a ministerial broadcast, Mr Callaghan's theme was the opportunity the election offered his supporters. He appealed for the return of a Labour government strong enough to see through the measures it had already put in hand.
Now, one question that will come up time after time in the next few weeks is this. Will a sudden reversal of policy, a jerk in the entirely opposite direction, really do the trick? I want to say quite plainly that I do not believe there is any magic solution to these problems, and it would do great harm if the country was suddenly to go into reverse on the range of policies that have brought us through so far. Then there's another question. How can we ensure peace in industry and avoid the disruption that we've seen? I believe that cooperation and partnership, not confrontation, will serve us best.
So the Prime Minister spoke in what was effectively his first election broadcast of the campaign, defending the way his administration, without a clear Commons majority at any time, had governed against considerable odds, and suggesting that a Thatcher victory would tear everything up by the roots. We'll see how Mrs. Thatcher responds tomorrow night on television. Today in the Commons she was brief and cool, unlike the House, which demonstrated boyishly around her. The Prime Minister had already announced the May the 3rd date from number 10. At the dispatch box, he spoke of some of the dangers of the campaign.
If now either side were to engage in a Dutch auction in giving wage increases of an excessive character, an unjustifiable character to those who demand them, then the future of this country would be very bleak. If we had been willing to do so, we would not be having perhaps some of the industrial troubles we're now passing through.
The Tory laughter revealed that they didn't think the Prime Minister, in some circumstances, was above a bit of a Dutch auction himself, a point Mrs. Thatcher took up herself, referring to yesterday's government's offer of higher pensions.
As the Prime Minister mentioned his dislike of Dutch auctions in connection with what may occur during the next 3 or 4 weeks, may I make it quite clear, then, that we shall honour the pension commitments which he announced yesterday.
Well, the mood of the House showed how thoroughly, although with a touch of gaiety about it, the election fight is truly joined. One of the snags of May the 3rd as a polling day is that it coincides with English and Welsh local elections, already fixed for that day. Not a snag for Labour, incidentally, because it ups their usually rather poor local election turnout, helping them to win councils they might not otherwise. But it does mean that the polling day routine for most of us is going to be a slightly odd affair, because the voting papers for the two elections will go into the same steel box. The parliamentary ones will be as normal, but the local ones will be tinted a special colour and will have bold lines running round the edges. Another change is that the hours of local voting, normally 8 in the morning to 9 at night, are going to extend to conform with the parliamentary election hours of 7 to 10. The main strain, however, will fall on the people running the election in each constituency and district. Stockport is one place where problems are already envisaged, as David Davies reports.
Here inside Stockport Town Hall, these are the ballot boxes normally used for general elections and for district council elections too. But now that both elections are to be held on the same day, they're already asking, have they got enough ballot boxes to go round?
And so tests are to be carried out to see just how many ballot papers the boxes really can hold. Normally, they count the votes from 4 constituencies here. They're considering moving some of the counts elsewhere. And another option is to count votes from the general election on election night, those from the district elections the next day.
I understand that all the votes will be, for the 2 elections, will be put into the 1 box. And that is the start of our problems.
What particular problems?
First of all, is to, at the close of the count, to outsort the votes for the 2 elections, first of all. And then there's the physical count, one before the other, of course.
But if both counts did go ahead on election night, they could be counting here until 5 or 6 o'clock the next morning. Already they're looking for extra staff.
The night of those difficulties is still 5 weeks away. More notice has been given of this election, in fact, than has happened for many years. It qualifies for the long campaign the Prime Minister wanted, and which Mrs. Thatcher knows she's going to have to play rather carefully. Little time, however, is being given to the Commons to finish off odd fragments of relatively non-controversial legislation, the biggest of which is the Merchant Shipping Bill. But the House of Lords are distinctly unhappy about putting their mark of approval on such a large bill without thorough examination, and tonight they were kicking up rough. There is another row as well over exactly what shall take place, or take the place, of next Tuesday's expected budget. There'll be no budget as such, only a measure to extend tax-collecting powers. But even this relatively simple situation has given the parties something to argue about.
The problem is the so-called Rooker-Wise amendment on income tax, which raises personal tax-free allowances to allow for the effects of inflation. It was introduced in 1977 to avoid the problem where people pay more tax just because salaries have gone up with inflation. Well, should it be in the caretaker budget? Some Labour ministers felt yes, otherwise this essentially standby budget would in effect be deflationary. But Tories argued that the amendment, on its own, would distort tax revenues and was better left on ice. Well, Chancellor Healey and Sir Geoffrey Howe discussed it all today. Apparently, Rooker-Wise will go ahead on Tuesday, but in a way that means it won't reach pay packets until a new government is installed.
There's no argument about that being necessary, but we think that it's sensible for any final decision about allowances in the next tax year to be left to the incoming government to decide as well. So the operation will be to secure the protection against inflation, but to leave the field open for a new government to make any other changes it might think possible and desirable.
And are you sure that you know what you'll be told on Tuesday and that you'll approve it?
The substance of it we know, and the essential thing is that it is to be a holding operation and not a budget. It's simply leaving the decks as they were for a new government to bring in the effective budget after the election.
The City, meanwhile, chose to celebrate last night's Commons vote. The Financial Times share index jumped 19.5 points this morning to a record 557.8, although it slipped back later. Business was steady all day, with few pre-election nerves. So I asked one stockbroker why everything had shot up so strongly.
The City believes that there will be a Conservative victory. They believe that that will bring the end to dividend restraint, a reduction in the powers of the Price Commission, and a cut in taxation. And all of those will increase the amount of money to go into investments and indeed increase the return on investments. But as we get nearer the election, I suspect the stock market will become more cautious.
Well, whatever the City may want, all the political parties will undoubtedly reveal next week the budgets they'd really like to introduce after the election. And the voters, presumably, will wish to separate out the economics from the politics.
Today is by-election day in the Liverpool constituency of Edge Hill. It had been held by the late Labour MP, Sir Arthur Irvine, with a 6,000 majority. The news of the coming general election has produced a relatively high turnout, 60%, despite the grey weather. Whoever succeeds Sir Arthur will be one of the shortest-serving MPs in history, as he'll have to stand again at the general election. The result is expected at about midnight and will be carried on BBC1 in a specially extended edition of the Tonight programme. And now finally, just to recap on the dates for the general election, announced this afternoon. Parliament will have its final session next Wednesday, before being officially dissolved on April the 7th. The general election will take place on Thursday, May the 3rd. The new Parliament will meet for the first time 6 days later, before the state opening on May the 15th. And now for the other big stories tonight. In Iran, the Ayatollah Khomeini's troops face more trouble on the borders. We've a special report from one area, and we've reports from Baghdad, where Arab oil sheikhs have fallen out over the Middle East peace treaty. And from Uganda, where President Amin's regime is said to be facing panic in Kampala. We hear from our man on the border. And heavy flooding adds to the winter misery in the northeast. Tomorrow will be a critical day for the new government of Iran. Its plans for an Islamic republic will be put to the people in a referendum. But already the new men are finding Iran is a hard country to hold together. Minority groups are struggling to gain autonomy, and today the Ayatollah Khomeini admitted there had been violence in 3 widely spaced provinces. The most serious challenge to Tehran's rule is coming from the Turkoman, a tribe who live in the north on both sides of the border with the Soviet Union. For 4 days now, around Gonbad, the tribesmen have been battling with the army and with Islamic irregulars. Our correspondent, Simon Dring, has been in the midst of it.
The masked guerrillas of Islam have little more than a shaky hold on less than half of Gonbad, but they make a big show of it. There's an atmosphere of chaos and uncertainty, distrust and fear in the streets. With much bravado, young Khomeini militiamen waving an assortment of weapons man makeshift barricades. But after 3 days of fighting, the government forces are, in fact, very much on the defensive. It's a stalemate that has so far cost at least 130 dead and wounded on the government side, and many more, it's reported, amongst the tribesmen. On the eve of the referendum, and only a few days after the end of the fighting in Kurdistan, the new Iranian regime is now at war against the communists. At least that's who the army commanders and the Khomeini militia here claim is behind this most recent outbreak of violence in the country. To put pressure on the Turkomans, the army was ordered into the town on Wednesday and told to be ready to use as much force as necessary to break them. This is nothing less than a communist-inspired insurrection, said one officer. The Turkoman uprising, however, is much more to do with minority rights and the possession of land than communism, even if they are getting help, as the government claims, from left-wing guerrillas. The column met little resistance as it moved towards the town. There was some shooting, but most of it one way and into empty buildings. At one point, they surrounded and searched a deserted factory where the night before the Turkomans had put up roadblocks. 2 people were killed and 1 taken prisoner, but it was impossible to distinguish him from any of the other young men in the town. It's a dangerous and hostile town for anybody who doesn't carry a gun or follow the green Islamic flag. We were variously shot at, abused, arrested, beaten, had film destroyed and equipment damaged. Even at the hospital, where all the doctors are allowed to do is bury the dead and treat the wounded. If the army and the militia are to be believed, then even a negotiated end to the fighting will not bring the war to an end. For these young men in their bunkers, the bogey of communism has replaced that of the Shah, and Gonbad has seen the start of it. This is Simon Dring in Gonbad.
Egypt is said to have put its armed forces on full alert as a response to troop movements by Libya. The 2 Arab neighbours have been to war as recently as 1977, and tension has been building since Egypt signed its peace treaty with Israel. Western diplomats say that Egypt has been moving troops and armour towards the Libyan border for several days, and it has accused Syria of flying warplanes to Libya. Both Syria and Libya are among the fiercest critics of the peace treaty, and together with the Palestinians, they've walked out of the Arab League conference in Baghdad, which was discussing reprisals against Egypt. The hardliners are demanding a total oil embargo on Egypt and the United States, but the moderates are willing to impose only a partial trade boycott on Egyptian firms which deal with Israel. The Baghdad conference has been adjourned for 24 hours to seek a compromise. Keith Graves reports.
The demonstrations that have accompanied this conference have shown quite clearly where the Baghdad masses stand on the question of the peace treaty. If it was left to these people to decide what action to take against President Sadat and President Carter, the whole issue, and for that matter the 2 presidents' throats, would be cut and dried. But it's in the more sombre and reflective atmosphere of the ironically named Palace of Peace that the decisions have been taken, or as it turns out, not taken. The atmosphere there has not been quite as unanimous as amongst the crowds outside. Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat has done most of the talking during the 3 days of the conference, indulging in what a member of one delegation described as an haranguing session against the moderates, demanding that they punish harshly Presidents Sadat and Carter. His efforts have left the moderates, led by Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal, unmoved. One member of the Saudi delegation accused Mr. Arafat of being over-theatrical, and it was the Saudis who finally suggested the 24-hour postponement. And so one final effort to present some sort of a unified front will be made tomorrow night, but even if, and it's a big if, some compromise is reached, the unified front against the treaty those present had hoped for at the beginning has collapsed and cannot convincingly be rebuilt. This is Keith Graves in Baghdad.
Saudi Arabia, the leader of the moderate camp, has tempered any sanctions against Egypt with the proviso that they should not cause any harm to the Egyptian people. But the Saudi oil minister, Sheikh Yamani, explained today that they still disapproved of the peace treaty.
Studies show that this is not really the peace we want. What we want in Saudi Arabia is a real and just peace in the area, which gives back our territory and which enables the Palestinians to get their legitimate right. Until we have that, then we have no peace. A small piece of peace is no peace.
The Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, has arrived in Bonn on his way home, where he was met by the West German president, Walter Scheel. Mr. Sadat is seeking financial aid to improve Egypt's economy, as well as political support for the Middle East peace treaty. He's meeting Chancellor Schmidt over dinner tonight, when the form of the aid will be discussed in detail. Meanwhile, Mr. Begin has arrived home in Israel to be feted as the man who brought peace with one of his neighbours for the first time in its history. Later, he was received in a special ceremony outside the Knesset in Jerusalem. Although a military guard of honour was on hand, the traditional gun salute was abandoned. Instead, 200 doves were released into the night sky as a sign of peace. In Uganda, invading forces from Tanzania are reported to have entered the suburbs of the capital, Kampala. Westerners evacuated to Kenya have reported widespread panic in the city. Ugandan rebels, who formed a government in exile, headed by Professor Yusuf Lule, claimed that their forces could now capture Kampala at will, and they maintained that President Amin had fled to northern Uganda. There's no way to tell exactly what is happening in Kampala, but the first batch of foreigners to be evacuated crossed into Kenya today at the border post of Malaba. Brian Barron went to the border to hear their account of events.
Thousands of Ugandans are themselves fleeing Kampala. Some are walking and carrying their possessions, others are crowded into buses and lorries. This major exodus, the first reported since the war moved close to Kampala, is taking place along the main road leading to Jinja, 50 miles east of the capital. Tonight at the Mulaba border outpost, United Nations personnel who came out in the first wave of a UN evacuation of dependents said that during the panic in Kampala, most offices and banks closed. Another foreigner told me that a Ugandan army barracks reportedly received a direct hit during a shelling attack. He said Ugandan soldiers were throwing away their uniforms and joining the exodus. Among the foreigners who left today was the Saudi Arabian ambassador and staff. Although artillery shells from the Tanzanian invasion force have been falling around Entebbe International Airport, it is still in use. Overnight, foreign residents saw 3 large transport planes taking off. This is Brian Barron on the Ugandan border.
In America, there's a major security alert over a radiation leak at a nuclear power plant near Harrisburg in Pennsylvania. The plant was sealed off after its cooling system failed last night, releasing radioactive steam into the atmosphere. Radiation is still leaking, and it's been detected in the air 20 miles away. Here's Martin Bell.
At the time of the accident, the plant's number 1 reactor was closed for routine refueling. The newer number 2 reactor, which had been in service for only 3 months, was working at full capacity when 2 malfunctions occurred, one after the other. The first was in the turbine building, a failure of one of the cooling pumps. The second was in the reactor unit itself, when during the automatic shut-off of high pressure, there was a release of radioactive water. A tank overflowed, and a low level of radioactivity escaped through an air vent, to be detected on the eastern perimeter of the site nearly 7 hours later. Some fuel elements in the reactor core had even started to melt. The power station itself was closed, but no one living nearby was evacuated, and the generating company, besieged by newsmen, was playing the emergency down.
The plant is in a safe condition. We may have some minor fuel damage, but we don't believe at this point that it's extensive. The radiation levels at the site boundary are really only 1/10 of the general emergency level where we normally get concerned. We do have our crews out. We're monitoring for airborne contamination. The amount that we found is minimal. Very small traces of radioactivity have been released from the plant.
The mishap at 3 Mile Island follows the recent closure of 5 other nuclear power stations because their design was said to be insufficiently earthquake-proof. And this latest bad publicity will further strengthen the hand of the strong anti-nuclear lobby here. The accident that happened here was of the sort that can at worst produce a meltdown, the calamity that the nuclear power industry fears the most and does most to guard against. In this case, the precautions worked, but they didn't work quite well enough to prevent some old fears about the safety features of these stations from resurfacing. This is Martin Bell near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Civil servants are to get a new pay offer. Mr. Callaghan announced this in the Commons just 3 days before a national one-day strike planned for Monday. All 9 unions are meeting tomorrow to hear about the offer, which is said to represent a substantial improvement on the previous one of 7%. And one dispute has been settled. NUPE has agreed to call off the industrial action by its 10,000 ambulance men. They'll now accept the government's offer of 9% plus £1 a week and a comparability study. 3 army cadets, one of them a girl, were injured at Aintree Racecourse today by riderless horses. One of the boys is said to be seriously ill. The 3 cadets were helping to repair damaged fences on the first day of the Aintree meeting. 3 riderless horses crashed through the rails into them. One boy was knocked unconscious. The other cadets are suffering from shock. There's been severe flooding in the northeast of England, with many people forced to leave their homes. The worst of it was in County Durham and Cleveland. Trouble was caused by a combination of thawing snow and heavy rain overnight. Stuart Preble reports.
Over 2 inches of rain overnight, combined with the sudden thaw of deep snow in lowland areas, was enough to burst the banks of many of the North's rivers, bringing chaos to towns and cities throughout the northern region. Cleveland was the worst affected, with hundreds of families evacuated from their homes overnight, and the police appealing for owners of small dinghies to help reach more families cut off by the rising tide. In Chestler Street in County Durham, a stream which usually runs into the River Wear was forced back and flooded the town centre to a depth of 4 feet. Dozens of roads were closed, including the motorway south of Newcastle, for a time. The raging overnight storms made a sorry sight of a big camping exhibition taking place in Newcastle. Damage here alone has been estimated at several £1,000s. The Weather Centre says this has been the wettest March in the north since records began in 1886, with 3 times the average rainfall. But they say the worst should now be over.
And finally, the main points from tonight's big story. The general election will be on May the 3rd, the same day as local government elections in England and Wales. Mr. Callaghan says he hopes it'll be fought on political issues, not on personalities. Mrs. Thatcher says that if the Conservatives win, her government will honour the pensions pledge made in the Commons by Mr. Callaghan. And a footnote to it all. As the Commons started wrapping up the business of this Parliament, some MPs pressed for time to debate a vital issue: MPs' pay. One of them, Mr. Andrew Faulds, said bank managers are becoming increasingly impatient and wives need the standard of living some of us used to have in previous occupations. Well, presumably after the election, some MPs will be returning to those occupations. That's it from the newsroom. Good night.